April 5th, 1531. The sky dawned gray over London, as if nature itself sensed the horror about to unfold. A crowd gathered at Smithfield, the customary site for executions and cattle fairs. Today, however, something different awaited them. In the center of the square, an enormous bronze cauldron rested atop a freshly lit fire. The flames crackled as the water began to heat. A murmur rippled through the crowd when guards brought forth a bound man. His name was Richard Roos, a cook in the service of Bishop John Fisher. His pale face revealed the terror he felt, contemplating the instrument of his death. In moments, he would face an execution, as rare as it was brutal. He would be boiled alive, feeling every inch of his skin slowly dissolve in boiling water. How did a simple cook end up condemned to such a terrible fate? To understand this macabre story, we must turn back the clock several weeks. February 1531. England was experiencing one of the most turbulent periods in its history. King Henry VIII was determined to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, to wed Anne Boleyn. This decision divided the kingdom. On one side stood ambitious courtiers who supported the king's desire. On the other, conservative clerics who considered marriage sacred and indissoluble. Among the latter was John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, one of the staunchest opponents of the royal divorce. Fisher, a man of deep religious convictions, had earned the enmity not only of Henry VIII, but also of the Boleyn family, who saw him as an obstacle to their ambitions. The bishop lived in constant apprehension. He slept in different chambers each night and took extraordinary precautions with his food and drink, fearing an attempt on his life. His paranoia, as we shall see, was not unjustified. At the episcopal residence in Lambeth, south of London, Bishop Fisher maintained a staff of servants, including Richard Roos, his cook. Roos was not particularly remarkable, an ordinary middle-aged man with no distinguishing features that set him apart from the mass of servants who kept the great houses functioning. Discreet and efficient, he had never given reason for suspicion until that fateful February 18th. That afternoon, Fisher hosted a meal for guests. The menu included a thick soup, common in the English diet of the time. Roos prepared the broth as usual but secretly added a powder to the food. Later, he would claim he did it as a jest, believing it to be merely a purgative that would cause intestinal discomfort. A cruel prank, but not lethal, according to his version of events. The bishop, however, ate little of the soup, not from suspicion, but perhaps from lack of appetite. Other guests consumed larger portions. At the end of the meal, the leftover food was distributed, as was customary, to beggars who had come seeking alms. Among them were Bennet Kirwin and Alice Trippitt, two humble people who could scarcely believe their luck at receiving hot food from a bishop's kitchen. Hours later, the horror began. Excruciating abdominal pains struck all who had consumed the soup. Vomiting, cold sweats, convulsions. Fisher survived, having ingested little of the poison. Others fell gravely ill. Bennet and Alice, however, who had eagerly devoured their portions, were not so fortunate. Their bodies were found the next day, contorted in agony. News of the poisoning spread rapidly. Henry VIII himself, upon learning of the incident, was furious. Although Fisher was his political adversary, an attack of such nature threatened the very institution of monarchy. If bishops could be poisoned, who would guarantee the safety of the king himself? The monarch ordered an immediate investigation. Richard Roos was quickly captured while attempting to flee London. Taken to the Tower of London, he was subjected to the rack, a method of torture in which the prisoner was tied to an X-shaped structure, his limbs stretched almost to breaking point. Under excruciating pain, Roos confessed to adding the powder to the soup, but insisted he was unaware of its lethal power, believing it to be merely a purgative intended to cause temporary discomfort. Surprisingly, the case did not follow normal legal procedures. On February 28th, Henry VIII personally appeared before Parliament to report the crime, something extraordinary for the era. The king described the poisoning as an act of high treason, not just against Bishop Fisher, but against the crown itself. Parliament, always eager to please the temperamental monarch, quickly approved the Act for Poisoning, 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9, which classified poisoning as high treason and established a specific punishment for such a crime: death by boiling. This fact deserves special attention. Henry VIII not only determined Rose's guilt without a proper trial, but also retroactively created a law to punish him in exemplary fashion. The penalty for treason was already terrible. The condemned was dragged by horses, hanged until nearly dead, castrated, and quartered alive. But the king wanted something more, something that would equate to the horror of poisoning: a slow death in which the criminal would experience progressive heat, feeling his body cook slowly. Why such cruelty? Why the king's personal involvement in a case that, although serious, involved only a cook and a bishop, who wasn't even his ally? The motives were never fully clarified. Some historians suggest that Henry VIII had a genuine phobia of poisoning, considering it the most cowardly of deaths, unworthy even for his enemies. Others, more skeptical, see more complex political motivations. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, a confidant of Fisher and staunch defender of Queen Catherine, suggested in correspondence that the king acted with such vehemence to divert suspicions from himself, as he is too noble to resort to such means, or at least from the lady, Anne Boleyn, and her father. This theory is not without foundation. Rumors circulated quickly after the poisoning, accusing the Boleyn family of having hired Rose to eliminate Fisher, one of the greatest obstacles to Henry's marriage plans. The cook's swift and spectacular execution could serve to end any deeper investigation that might potentially implicate figures close to the king. Whatever the truth, Richard Rose's fate was sealed. His execution was set for April 5th. Such an unusual event drew crowds to Smithfield. People pushed to get a good viewing angle. Street vendors circulated offering food and drink, as if this were a theatrical spectacle and not the atrocious end of a human being. The great bronze cauldron was already bubbling when Rose was brought forth. Some accounts suggest he was partially sedated with alcohol, a final act of mercy for one who would receive no other. The guards stripped him and lifted him above the cauldron. A prayer was quickly recited by a priest, offering absolution for his sins, but no relief for his body. What followed was one of the most horrifying executions recorded in English history. 3 times Rose was immersed in the boiling water. On the first dip, only his legs were submerged. His screams echoed across the square as the skin of his lower limbs separated from the flesh. Some people in the crowd fainted. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight. On the second dip, his torso was submerged to the chest. The water, previously clear, acquired a pinkish hue as it dissolved his flesh. His screams were no longer human. They became indistinct gurgles as he struggled for air. On the third and final dip, Richard Roose was completely immersed in the boiling water. Death, though horrible, finally freed him from his torment. Rose's execution was not an isolated case. Thanks to the new law, those convicted of poisoning would face the same fate. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davies was boiled alive at Smithfield for allegedly poisoning 3 households where she worked. This method of execution was only officially abolished during the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, as part of reforms aimed at limiting the most barbaric punishments. What makes Richard Roose's case particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of his punishment, but the political circumstances surrounding it. He was a victim of a volatile historical moment, when England stood on the threshold of monumental religious and political changes. John Fisher, the man Rose allegedly attempted to kill, would not escape his own tragic fate. 4 years after the incident, in 1535, Fisher was executed for refusing to recognize Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England. His head was displayed on London Bridge until it became unrecognizable, then replaced by that of Thomas More, another opponent who suffered the same fate. Anne Boleyn, whose rise to the throne was indirectly related to the Ruse case, would not enjoy a happy ending either. In 1536, just 5 years after these events, she herself would be executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, all widely considered fabrications to allow Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. As for Henry VIII himself, he would continue his turbulent reign for another 16 years, marrying 4 more women, breaking definitively with Rome, and transforming England into a Protestant country. His paranoia and brutality would only increase with age, leaving a trail of blood that would forever mark English history. Today, the site where Richard Ruse met his terrible end is a busy commercial center, with no plaque or monument to remember the horrors committed there. Few Londoners passing daily through Smithfield know that beneath their feet, centuries ago, a man was slowly boiled alive in a bronze cauldron. The story of Richard Ruse offers us a disturbing glimpse into the past. It reminds us of a time when justice and cruelty went hand in hand, when the powerful could literally rewrite laws to satisfy their whims, and when the value of human life was determined by the political utility of one's death. It is impossible to determine today whether Rose was truly guilty, whether he was a scapegoat to cover up a larger conspiracy, or whether he simply made a tragic mistake by adding unknown substances to his master's food. What we know with certainty is that his punishment exceeded any sense of justice, even by the brutal standards of his time. Execution by boiling, a death that recreates the very act of cooking, Ruse's profession, carries a macabre irony that cannot be ignored. The man whose life was dedicated to preparing food in cauldrons ended his days as an ingredient in one. It is a punishment that suggests not just the elimination of the criminal, but a terrible poetic vengeance that aimed to satisfy the sense of retributive justice of a more brutal era. 5 centuries have passed since that April afternoon in Smithfield. The world has changed in ways that Henry VIII and his contemporaries could hardly imagine. Our justice systems, though imperfect, now seek rehabilitation more than retribution. Our laws are, supposedly, applied equally to the powerful and the common. Our punishments, even for the most heinous crimes, do not include deliberate torture. Nevertheless, the story of Richard Ruse, the man who was boiled alive, continues to fascinate us precisely because it shows us how thin the line is that separates civilization from barbarism, and how institutions that should protect citizens can easily become instruments of terror when manipulated by those in power. Under the hurried feet of modern Londoners, the echoes of the past still resonate, and if we listen carefully, perhaps we can still hear the screams of a cook who, on a gray April day in 1531, discovered in the most terrible way what it means to be on the other side of the cauldron.